Diane Ravitch is the president and co-founder of the Network for Public Education. She is a historian of education and research professor at New York University. Diane blogs at dianeravitch.net, and her blog is close to surpassing 36 million hits. She has written 11 books, including her latest book, Slaying Goliath. Amy Frogge has served as a member of the Metro Nashville School Board since 2012 and is the executive director of Pastors for Tennessee Children. She is a licensed attorney, public school parent, and former PTO president at her children's Title I public school. As a school board representative, she has advocated for whole child education, a rich, broad curriculum for all, and community schools, while opposing school privatization. Diane and Amy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Carol, and welcome to everyone who is listening or watching tonight. I am very privileged to be able to talk with Amy. I was trying to remember as we were in the pre-show minutes when I first met Amy, and actually I heard about Amy. I heard about her because I was getting news clips from all around the country about what was happening in different districts. And I read about this woman who ran for school board, and she ran as a parent who was concerned about doing her civic duty. And she ran for school board with, I would say, pure motives, just wanting to be helpful as an attorney, as someone who was experienced at the local level. And she was quite astonished to discover that her opponent outspent her by some phenomenal sum. It was something like 5-1. And as I recall from writing about Amy, she had raised $25,000 to spend, and her opponent had $125,000, and yet Amy won. That was in 2012. And Amy at that time was not aware, as I read her story, and she can tell it herself, but she was not aware of what she was getting into, because Nashville was a prime target for privatization through charters. And there was quite a battle going on with the governor, with the mayor, the mayor was a Democrat, the governor was a Republican, the state commissioner, Kevin Huffman, the ex-husband of Michelle Rhee, was very strong for privatization. He supported the governor's plans to expand charters. I believe he even supported vouchers. And he's a graduate of Teach for America, and so was obviously very supportive of Teach for America. So lots of money and lots of outside forces were focusing on Nashville and continue to do so. And I've been watching Nashville with concern because I know they've had hard-fought school board elections. Amy has been in the thick of it. And since her election in 2012, she has been a voice for public education. And it's been quite an interesting scene. So I wanted to invite Amy to talk tonight because I think Nashville in many ways is a typical American city. It's not New York City, obviously, but New York City is atypical. I mean, I can think of lots of atypical cities. New Orleans is atypical, having had its schools and teachers union wiped out by a hurricane. But Nashville is more like middle America, and there are probably dozens of cities in the same situation as Nashville, having been targeted by very powerful out-of-state interests. And so I thought this would be a good time to talk about what's happening in Nashville today, what Amy has experienced as a school board member, and what are the issues that are facing Nashville in terms of responding to the coronavirus and how the school, many things to talk about. And I have to add just one other thing, which is that in my latest book, Slaying Goliath, I singled out Amy as one of the heroes of the resistance because she's an example of someone who stepped forward and said her piece and has said it very eloquently and repeatedly. And she's had an impact, and she's stood up against very powerful forces, and in each case has prevailed. So I think she has a lot to tell us. And I think, she's just one of the people I admire tremendously. So Amy, it's wonderful to see you, and welcome to our almost weekly discussion of current issues in education.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. And I want to say I appreciate you so much, your efforts to raise awareness about these issues. You're just a go-to person for so many people on any number of issues, and then your efforts to connect us nationally. And I really have benefited from being part of the Network for Public Education because it's a diverse group of voices. And when I come to your conference, I feel like these are my people. we're all advocating for the same things, and I have learned a lot and made some important connections because of you. So thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for having me.
Well, tell us about, first of all, give us a little background about Nashville, about your first run for office. It was your first ever run for office. And how did that go? And what did you learn when you first ran and won your position on the school board?
Well, so I will just say I fell into this backwards. I did not have any idea what I was getting into. A lot of these efforts were ramping up in Nashville, but in 2012, that was the first election where big money came into the race. And so my story started with the flood of 2010 in Nashville, which was a transformative experience for our family. It seemed a little trivial with everything we now have going on, but my family lost, we got flooded. We lost the bottom floor of our house. I had 2 young children at the time. And we had just an immense amount of help. People came from all over to help us clean up our house and rebuild it. We had meals delivered every day for weeks. I mean, I was just sort of overwhelmed by the generosity of folks, and some of them were from out of state. We had different church groups showing up. And so after that experience, I had a daughter who was in our zoned little neighborhood public school, and we had put her in the school really without a whole lot of thought about getting in the right school district. And when I first had looked at it, it was on greatschools.net, had a rating of, I think, 4 out of 10. And we had people saying, oh, don't send your child there. We got into school and realized it was a lovely little school. It just didn't have a lot of support, enthusiasm around it, not a lot of parent involvement, and which had ebbed and waned, at different times it had more. But after the flood, I thought, well, I really want to give back and to my community. And so I decided that I would step up and help. And so we had so little parent involvement that our PTO had died, and so only 2 of us were willing to do it. We sat on my front porch, and I became the de facto PTO president. And the 2 of us just got really involved at the school. And it's a Title I school, very diverse, surprisingly diverse for a kind of outlying area in Nashville. We had 23 countries represented at the school at the time. But over about 2 years, we built a whole lot of support for the school. We built about 15 new community partnerships. We were working with nonprofits. I like to garden, so we planted 30 trees that I watered from the back of my car for a couple years in the summer. We put in rain gardens and a cute butterfly garden. We brought in a teaching garden with a grant from the American Heart Association. Had therapy dogs coming in, started sponsoring big events, fall festival, springtime festival, developed little cute bumper stickers. And anyway, out of all of this, this building support for the school and building parent involvement, miraculous things happened at our little local school. The test scores went up. The culture changed, and now I have to laugh because the school that everyone warned us, don't send your child there. Now we have people actually that move to the area to go to this particular school. So you really, a few involved parents really can change a school. So I recognized some of the issues going on. I didn't know what was causing them. Too much testing. We didn't have recess time, much of any, maybe 10 minutes a day. The teaching garden kind of died because they implemented so much testing that there was then a lack of commitment from the teachers to work, with the teaching curriculum, all those things. And so I ended up some friends thought it would be great for me to run for school board. That was my vision. I thought, I'm going to run and do for, the cities. I'm going to do what I did for my little neighborhood school and, build up support and enthusiasm for public schools. And when I ran, as you mentioned, this is the first time big money had come into the race. I was told I could raise about 10 to 15,000. It would be okay. And then my opponent raised a record sum. And I managed to win. But as soon as I set foot on the board, we stepped directly into the eye of the storm with major charter school battles, which have waned in the last couple of years, but went on for a good 4 years. So I guess that's my background and how I got involved in the first place.
So you joined the board in 2012. When did the next election come along?
2016, and 2016 was far worse. We had Stand for Children was involved, and so my first opponent raised
Stop a
100.
second. Explain,
Yeah.
what is Stand for Children and why were they involved? Where was the money coming from?
So Stand for Children is an organization out of Oregon. I believe it's based in Oregon now. Is that right?
Or it's Oregon.
Yeah, and it originally had started out as a grassroots organization. So there was some goodwill around Stand for Children at the time, but like all of these things, that had become corrupted. And so Stand for Children now is now pushing for charter schools and school privatization. Bill Gates funded, and so anyway, there are a lot of organizations around public education that may have started out as a grassroots effort that have now evolved into something different as public education has become corporatized. So, but anyway, so the second election, it became, it was difficult to walk through. I knew it was going to be hard, but my opponent ended up raising, we estimate around $200,000. So again, I was outfunded 5-1. Just huge amounts of money. I mean, it turned into a state race basically for the Nashville School Board. We had all kinds of horrible mailers. They were doing push calls, like push phone calls, where they call people and they sort of spout off like untrue statements about the candidate, and it was supposed to be a poll, but actually they're trying to smear you. All kinds of media coverage. It was just pretty awful. But we succeeded both times. Second time I won by a heart margin with about 65% of the vote. And it was because this was truly a grassroots effort. There was a local paper that kind of exposed that this was not just a local race. This was national dark money coming into Nashville. And it was charter. It was all about charters. And this was sort of the tipping point for the board. If we had lost too many seats, the system would have become charterized, and we were able to pretty much block that with the 2016 election, but it was a big challenge.
So you have, I assume, an election coming up in 2020. Is that correct?
Yes, and I am not running this time. We have coming up in August, but there is a teacher that is running for my position, so I think that the seat will be well filled after I leave, hopefully, if she wins.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that there's this new organization called the City Fund, created by Reed Hastings, who's a billionaire, and John Arnold. Reed Hastings from California, who owns Netflix, and he's very devoted to charter schools. And he's collaborating with a billionaire from Texas named John Arnold. And they put, I think, $200 million into something called the City Fund. And they put out a list of target cities. Isn't Nashville on their list of target cities to be more charters? And basically, they're sending people in to elect people to the school board so that they don't have to shove charters down your throat. They just have to capture the school board and let them do the work.
Right. Well, and I'm not as familiar with the City Fund. I mean, I'm aware of City Fund, and I do believe that we're a target city for them. What I've seen since the 2016 election is that it seems to me that the privatizers are now concentrating all their efforts at the state level because they spent so much money locally and lost so badly. And we really, I think we're sort of a test case in Nashville. But we maintained the board in spite of all the money that came in. But what we now see is that, we have the Achievement School District at the state level, which is state run. That's had a lot of problems, but it still exists. And that allows the state to come in and take over any school in the state that's performing in the bottom 5% of schools. And so then they just turn those over to charter operators. And I can tell another long story about that. But that's a hostile takeover. And then they now have, while I'm on the board, another battle we had was we tried to block this, but now we have a state level charter authorizer. So now if the local board decides we don't want a charter school in the city, then they just appeal to the state, and the state can open a charter school, and we still have to pay for it. But the state, has authorized it. And then most recently, last year, the state, that the charter authorizer authority was with the State Board of Education. It has now moved to a new commission, which is appointed by the governor, which is going to be very pro charter school. So I would suspect any charter school that we deny is now going to get overturned on appeal. And so I think that's kind of where the energy has gone more to the state level than just the local school board elections, or at least that's how it's been for us in Tennessee, because the energy's died down a lot since 2016.
So you can see that there's an enormous advantage to capturing the governorship, the legislature. They can create these commissions to overturn local control. And I guess the thing that I find most astonishing about this is that Republicans used to be the party of local control. And now they're saying, forget local control. The governor should be able to overturn whatever he wants to overturn, regardless of what the local people want.
Right.
And so here you are in Nashville. Any decision that the Nashville board makes is going to be subject to a governor-appointed commission. And I just want, will they be able to take your tax funds away to give to charter operators?
Yes, that's what they're doing. I mean, we still pay for the schools after they authorize them. And I'll tell you we have a little horror story that happened here. As there was always a charter horror story, I guess, different places. But our most recent issue with the charter, it was a local school, actually. It was not a national chain, but it's called Knowledge Academies. I started getting phone calls from teachers there who were quietly trying to report major problems. The school, basically the guy who founded the school disappeared. They were missing like $300,000, which they claimed they had lost in an online phishing scheme, and then said magically some of that money reappeared, but they weren't paying teachers. They had just dismal outcomes for the kids. There was scholarship money missing. They were running side businesses out of the school, and including a for-profit side business. I mean, it was just a disaster. So we went through all the process to try to shut it down under state law, and it's a complicated multi-step process. And we, instead of trying to comply with the district's request for information, the school just started suing us as the board. It was a big mess, and then went up on appeal to the state overturned us and has reopened the school. And so now, we're continuing to have the same problems. They brought in a charter management company out of Florida, which appears to be pretty shady. In Tennessee, we cannot have for-profit management companies. So this is a deal where it's a husband and wife team that operate out of the same building. One side's for-profit, one side's not for-profit, two businesses, but that's who's managing us. Again, they're not complying with requests for information. So these are the kinds of things that happen when you lose local control of schools, and then there's really no accountability. Taxpayer dollars are not protected. And then the families are getting duped by these charter operators that are, making money on the side. So those are the kinds of stories that happen with the state level charter authorizer.
So I want to go back a minute to something you said a few minutes ago about the Achievement School District. I think that's one of the really interesting stories in the country because, as I understand it, the Achievement School District idea was based on what happened in New Orleans. And then the Achievement School District in Tennessee became the model for the Michigan Education Achievement Authority. It was then copied by Nevada, which has the lowest charters in the entire country. And then it was copied by North Carolina. But they had this problem in North Carolina, which is that every district that had a low performing school went to their state legislator and said, choose someone else, don't choose us. So they actually had, I think, both Republican and Democratic legislators saying, oh no, you can't touch my district. That's our school. We don't want that school. They ended up with an achievement school district in North Carolina with one school. That one school has a superintendent and a principal. And I think they've had multiple changes of personnel since it opened, but it hasn't been successful. I mean, the irony of these achievement school districts, ideas is that they've all been failures. And as you know, and Gary Rubenstein has in his blog has reported faithfully, the Tennessee Achievement School District has been a disaster. And of the schools that they took on initially, I recall that they brought in a high-flying charter operator, Chris Barbick from Houston, and he started off by saying, we'll take the lowest performing schools in the state of Tennessee, and within 5 years, they'll be in the top 25%. But the 5 years came and went, and poor Chris Barbick had a heart attack, so he left. And then somebody else came in, and by the time 5 years came along, well, we couldn't give the test that year because the test didn't work. It was invalid, technical problems. But by 6 years, not a single one of those schools that had been taken over was a high-performing school. They were all in either still in the bottom 5%, or I think one of them was in the bottom 6%.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's that's a very important story because it really shows that this idea of a hostile takeover has no merit. But let me move to the other side of the equation for a moment, which is talk about what's happened in the Nashville public schools. During your tenure in office, which is now close to 8 years, have you been able to increase recess? Have you been able to increase the arts in the schools? Have you been able to do any of the things that you hoped to do when you ran for office?
Well, we've had some successes. It's frustrating because all these good intentions, it feels like what I've been able to do is kind of help neutralize the greatest threat to the school system rather than build anything. And every new era that starts for our school board, I think, well, this is my chance, I'm going to be able to get these things passed and changed. So I haven't made as much progress as I would have liked. I was able to increase recess to 20 minutes a day for, I believe it was through 7th grade, maybe 6th grade. And I need to revisit that. There have been several battles at the legislature about recess. The problem is that there is so much testing, there is not time for recess. And so at the time when I first got on the board, I think the kids were getting something like 10 minutes, and that would include walking in and out of the building. So they just weren't getting any time at all. And you would be surprised at how much resistance there was to 20 minutes of recess for elementary school kids. But I did get that in place. I was able to help expand foreign language up through our middle schools. And there have been some challenges around that as well. And the arts, we have a lot of equity issues in the system. So I've been able to help expand arts programs in some schools, but I think we have yet as a school system to really visit those sorts of issues. And the underlying problem, like I said, is that there is so much stress and focus on testing and the test prep that goes on that no one has the time or energy to really look at these other, the other important pieces of education that the children need. But I am a little hopeful that maybe some of the conversations are starting to change a little bit now that we have been able to move past, the all charter all the time conversation. So I've done some, but not as much as I would have liked.
So I'm just curious to know who objected to 20 minutes of recess a day?
Well,
I mean, what were their objections? Not their names.
Yeah, no, I won't. Well, there were some board members that said things like, and these were people that sort of were in this market-based approach to school, this sort of the charter supporters. Well, we just need to give them full autonomy, do whatever the leaders, whatever they want. Maybe they want to do 10 minutes of yoga with the kids. And I was taking in, American Academy of Pediatrics reports, and they're recommending this amount of time, whatever. But it was, I think the objections were really from people who were supporting the privatization efforts, the testing. There's just been a push for all of the standardized testing, and it's under the guise of accountability, but the tests are so flawed, and we just have such absurd, amounts of testing that they're really not helping at all, and they're just causing us to cut out all of the great experiences that make children excited about learning and being in school.
So you probably know about this, but are you familiar with the book by William Doyle and Pazzi Sahlberg, Let the Children Play?
I've heard of it, yes. I've not read it. Yeah.
It would be a great source of ammunition for you in your battle for play and recess, because they gather the research and American Academy of Pediatrics and lots of other sources. And it's about how important play is. Play is a way that children learn.
Right.
And I visited Finland in 2011, and I was absolutely astonished to see that they have recess after every single class, a 15-minute break between every class. And the kids just run out of the building and they play for 15 minutes, and then they run back in refreshed. And the teachers have a few minutes to gather their thoughts in an absolutely beautifully appointed teacher's lounge, which I've never seen in an American school. But I think it's a radical idea when you say the children had 10 minutes of play, and then it was a struggle to make it 20 minutes, and that was a huge victory. And then when I think of Finland, where they have 15 minutes after every single class, we're so, I don't know, it seems like we're mean to children.
I know. And it's, I mean, the kids are not, they're sort of treated, a lot of these schools are like little business people. They're just going to sit there for 8 hours a day. It's not healthy. And as you said, that they learn through play. That's part of their development, healthy development as children. But I'm frustrated as a board member because I think that often, we don't make decisions based on evidence, and we don't make decisions based on, information from people who study the needs of children. And we've gotten so far off of that because we're so focused on these other so-called solutions, which aren't making a positive impact, and in fact, I think are harming children.
Well, I hope you had a chance to watch my conversation with Michael Hines. Michael's the superintendent on Long Island, where I am now, and he's a great believer in whole child education. And one of the things, when someone asked him, well, how do you make sure this is happening? He said, I shadow children, and I will choose a child in first grade or kindergarten or third grade, and I just stay with them all day. I want to know what their experience is. What's it like to be them, and what's their day like? And he doesn't like the idea of children being forced to sit for hour after hour, because that's not natural. Right. And children need to move. And in most American schools today, they're simply not moving enough, and they need movement. That's part of their development.
Right.
So
even with the testing,
that's a good one for you to continue fighting for, as long as you're there.
Right. I agree. And even with the testing, we fought this off finally, but they were having children as young as kindergartners filling in bubble tests. Well, they don't have the dexterity to fill in the bubbles. That's part of their development too. So we have just lost touch with children and what they need, as you're saying, and just basic, developmental milestones for children. And I don't know. I feel like the people that are creating the policies haven't been around real children. And a lot of the efforts that my efforts were based in my experiences with my own children and knowing what they need. They came out of a preschool, which was sort of a nature-based Montessori-esque school. So a lot of this was just a shock to me, because they were used to being outside and they were used to having freedom and exploration and creativity. And that was very challenging and stimulating to them. And then they had to go into an environment where everything was much more rigid and not healthy.
And did Tennessee adopt the Common Core standards?
Yes. Well, we did, and then it became a bad word. So then we changed them to the Tennessee standards, which really are still Common Core standards. So that battle continues in Tennessee.
Well, as you probably know, Common Core has been completely ineffective. We've had Common Core now. They were released about 10 years ago, and you can watch the national test scores, the NAEP scores. And the last two times they were released, in 2017 and then in 2019, they dropped. So we're settled into Common Core, and we've seen absolutely no positive effect. In fact, negative effect, because the lowest performing kids have seen real drops. Everybody's seen a decline, but the decline at the bottom for the lowest performing kids was really very serious. But as you said, it's quite amazing. The people who make policy don't seem to care. I years ago gave a talk at one of the research organizations called "Does Evidence Matter?" And my conclusion was it doesn't matter. It matters to a few people, but when you think about Secretary of Education, does Betsy DeVos care about education research? No, she says she's not a numbers kind of person. Well, you got to look at numbers, and the numbers say this isn't working. Well, did Arnie Duncan pay attention to evidence? I don't think so, because the evidence was that judging teachers by the test scores of their students is a very bad policy, because kids are not randomly assigned. And, you know, we've been trying this now for years. It has had no positive effect. So I think, you know, it's really time, and I hope that, and I know you're going to continue working on the education issues in your new role, but it really is time for a new idea about what we should be doing in education. I mean, it's very clear that all this high stakes testing has not produced anything that was promised. We've not seen gaps, you know, achievement gaps, opportunity gaps. These things haven't closed, and they're not even narrowing. So we need a better vision, a more child-centered vision. And I think that you're one of the warriors. Michael Hines is another that's in the forefront of that battle. Let me ask you about your new role being that you're now the executive director of Pastors for Tennessee Children. Talk about that and what that entails.
Well, so I have to thank you for that, because I ended up meeting the founder of Pastors for Children, which started in Texas, Charles Foster Johnson. He was a keynote speaker at your conference. I believe it was 2017. And we were on a panel together and connected, and I heard his keynote speech and was really just sort of blown away by the message about public education being a sacred trust, and a common good, and the need to protect all children and respond to these efforts to overtake public education, which are driven by greed and the desire for profit, with advocacy and service and prayer. And I thought that is the answer, and especially for Tennessee and these southern states, which have, you know, this background. And so anyway, he and I have been in contact since your conference, and he asked me to help head up the pastor's work here. And I'm a bit of an anomaly, because I am not a minister as many of his leaders are. So my role really is just to motivate and to bring together and organize the ministers so that we can get into the school. So the mission of Pastors for Children is twofold. First, it is just to support the schools, support the teachers and the children, and meet needs through service, and not to proselytize, not to go in with any you know, religious teachings, obviously. And Pastors for Children is also a big proponent of, you know, separation of church and state. So it is simply to come in with open hands, open hearts, and meet the needs of the kids. So pastors can do things, and their churches can do things like backpacks, you know, filling backpacks, or tutoring kids, or teacher appreciation days, that kind of thing. And we are trying to mobilize faith leaders across Tennessee to be involved in that way. But also we advocate for good policy and good laws at the state legislature. And I'm hoping that I can use my background, having been around this for nearly a decade in Tennessee, to just to help educate our legislators so that they better understand some of the motivating forces, which aren't really often the best for children. So that is my new role. And I'm excited to be able to do some work at the state level, because that is where so much, the laws are made at the state level, and then they affect everything we're trying to do locally. So I really think that we can make a big impact if we can make connections with our state legislators and help them understand what this is really all about, which isn't kids. Often not about kids.
So when I first met Charlie Johnson in Texas, and I'm from Texas, and we have that connection, I was very impressed with the fact that he was able to get so many rural ministers involved. Yeah. And they would then contact their legislator, and it didn't really matter if they were Democrat or Republican. They had quite a lot of Republican legislators who heard the message, and he would say, well, the minister would go and he would put his hand on the legislator's shoulder and say, we really don't want this for our community. In our community, you know, right. the school is the heart of our community. This is where the debate right. team is. This is where the football team is, the basketball team. You look in the hallways, there are all the plaques from the parents and the grandparents and aunts and uncles. Why would we want to give vouchers to kids why would we want to send them to church schools? Because, of course, the Baptist ministers, as you said, are strongly in favor of separation of church and state. And they have been amazingly effective in Texas, which has had a red state. It's been a red state. They have a Republican governor, a Republican lieutenant governor, and a Republican legislature. They just in the last election, I think, reduced the supermajority. But year after year, the Pastors for Texas Children has blocked vouchers. And that's been something, almost a miracle. So I credit them with that. And I know Tennessee, of course, has a different situation. And I'm very happy you're a lawyer, because I think you have to be a lawyer to follow all these things going on in education today, what with the efforts to use the law to bust local control and to impose vouchers. And so tell us a little bit about what happened with the vouchers. I know the story, but maybe many in our audience do not.
Sure. Well, so vouchers that's the ever-present issue at the legislature. I think you call it zombie legislation. Is that what, zombie bills? They're dead and nobody really wants them, but they keep arising and marching year after year. So that's what's happened in Tennessee. As long as I've been involved in the school board, every year there's a new voucher proposal. But initially here, and we've been up there fighting every year. And typically we're able to defeat voucher legislation because it is so widely unpopular. People just don't want vouchers, and the legislators understand that. So every year we've been able to defeat it with a pretty organized statewide effort. We would have Sunday phone calls and target different legislators and say, we had one person, we had their third grade teacher call on the legislature, say, you don't need to vote for this voucher bill. It's very bad for our kids. So anyway, so this has gone on for years. And then we had some major changes last year, 2019. We had a new governor who is very pro-voucher, and a Speaker of the House who they really put an immense amount of pressure on our legislators to expand the voucher law. At that time, we had a very small special needs voucher that was available, and I think something like 130 families statewide were using it. But typically with vouchers, they will start with a small, some small law, and then they expand it year after year until then they've got vouchers everywhere. And so last year, we had sort of a dramatic turn of events because there was just a heavy push for vouchers. And when it came time to vote for them on the floor, the final vote, the Speaker of the House just left the clock open for nearly an hour because he didn't have the votes, and finally got one guy to flip his vote and vote for vouchers, and we had them. And then afterwards there were allegations of corruption, that there was bribery going on to get this passed, and so the FBI got involved and has been looking into those allegations. And so all of a sudden we did have a voucher law, but it was so unpopular that every time I went through a committee, it got whittled down a little more. And by the end, it was only going to apply to Nashville and Memphis, who, by the way, all of our legislators did not want this. And then the other legislators who voted for it only voted for it because they said, well, I'm going to vote for this if you don't put it in my community. So that's how it got passed. And then after all that happened, there were two different lawsuits over the new voucher law. One, our school board and our mayor, our school board, and our city brought this. And then Shelby County, the city joined us. That's the Memphis schools, and not the Memphis school system. So that lawsuit was moving forward. Then a second lawsuit was filed on behalf of parents. And all of those lawsuits both of those were heard together recently by a trial court in Nashville that ruled the new law unconstitutional. And then the governor, after this happened, said, well, we're still going to move forward with implementing vouchers. And he had set aside almost $40 million for the implementation. There was some controversy because there was a no-bid contract for a company to implement the vouchers that the state had paid. And so then the state decided to appeal directly to the Supreme Court, the Tennessee Supreme Court, and said, you need to reach down and make this ruling, because they were trying to make it happen for this next year. And the Supreme Court declined to hear it. So basically now vouchers are not going to be implemented this year. And this was a rush job. It was supposed to be implemented in 2 years, but the governor's office and the powers that be were really pushing to get it in place. So we have had a major victory in Tennessee, because it's currently stopped, and I guess it will go up through the appeal process. I don't think they're going to give up, but it's very unlikely, I would say probably, that they will be able to overturn the ruling that vouchers are unconstitutional here. So that's a long story, but that's the full, that's the full.
It's a very interesting, and I think a very important story. And I'm sure you're well aware that what happens with vouchers is that they always begin with vouchers for children with special needs, because
Right.
who can refuse? Except the problem with that is, and no one ever points this out, that when children get vouchers to go to non-public schools, they abandon their constitutional rights. They are not covered by IDA or any other federal legislation designed to make sure that they get free and appropriate public education. And they're not entitled to anything once they leave the public system. But nonetheless, this is the way it works. And to me, the exemplar state would be Arizona, where they began with, or Florida, both of them same thing. First program, students for special vouchers for students with special needs. And then in Arizona is, well, we need vouchers for people living on Native American reservations. And then we need vouchers for the children of military families. And it's like the camel's nose gets under the tent, and it gets a little bit more and a little bit more. And then this last time around, they went for a dramatic expansion of vouchers, and a group of parents got together and challenged it in a referendum. And it was just, 6 women who had been out there testifying against it, and got together and said, let's work with SOS Arizona. They had to gather over 100,000 signatures to put it on the ballot. They had the Koch brothers fighting them, and Betsy DeVos's family fighting them on the other side, and tried to knock their referendum off the ballot, and they were unable to do it. And the referendum passed 65-35. I mean, the thing about vouchers is they're not popular anywhere.
No.
I mean, they have been put to a vote in, I forget how many states. There have probably been 20 state referenda, and some states have had more than one referenda. They have never passed, never. And it usually goes down 2 to 1 or more. And in Florida, they called it the Religious Freedom Amendment. And a majority of people voted against religious freedom, which is pretty amazing. But it was obviously an intent to fool the public.
Right.
And say, of course, I'm for religious freedom, not realizing that what they would be doing would be to knock out the limitation on spending public money for non-public schools.
Right.
So I think that in Tennessee, well, across the country, there are going to be big problems with the voucher issue because of the case that's now before the Supreme Court, the Espinosa case. And if the Supreme Court, particularly because of the 2 new appointees to the court, both of whom are, I would say, charitably religious zealots, if that case goes against public education, then every state law will be knocked out, and every state will have to fund religious schools in the same way that they fund public schools. So I think that's a scary prospect, and we'll have to see. I know that a lot of people think that might come down any day, but I'm hoping that the court will make a narrow decision. But given the addition of Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, this could be the time that they've been waiting for many, many years to fund. It's interesting that the people who, on the one hand, don't want to fund public schools, don't want to fund public services, don't want to fund Social Security, don't want to fund Medicare, they do want to fund religious schools. That's the only kind of public about is public funding for religious schools. So do you have a lot of ministers across the state, particularly in rural communities, who've been responsive to your message?
Yes, we're still building more in the rural communities, but well, Reverend Johnson came here and did sort of a statewide tour, and I think everybody that hears him speak is very moved by that. I saw teachers crying. I think people are so grateful that someone is coming in and just speaking truth about this, because it really is a moral battle that we're fighting. But anyway, we are building up the rural ministers, but I do think people, when they hear the message, they have been very responsive. And I think we're starting to have some regular Zoom conversations. And as I said, I would just like to sort of be a conduit to bring these ministers together, these faith leaders together, and also help educate. So that's the concept. We had a conversation about the vouchers and the lawsuits and when that happened. And so anyway, we are building, and I absolutely believe this is the answer for Tennessee and many southern states. And Pastors for Children also, I believe, is in 8 states now. So it is a quickly growing organization. There's a lot of interest in this message.
Well, I think what I appreciate most about it is the fact that they're reaching very different people than, let's say, the Network for Public Education can reach. I mean, we reach like-minded people, a lot of teachers, a lot of parents, but they're speaking to faith communities.
Right.
And, I think that it reaches a whole different level when people hear Reverend Charlie Johnson, and he talks about the mission of public schooling, the importance of public schooling, and the importance of separation of church and state. When he talks about religious liberty requires separation of church and state, that when you allow the church to when you allow the state to subsidize the church is putting its freedom at risk.
Right.
And I think a lot of people kind of understand this on a gut level, but when they don't hear many faith leaders saying it as articulately as Charlie Johnson does. And he makes it into, this is what the founding fathers understood, and we're with them. So this is a good thing.
Right. And I also, the rurals, I would also say, on another note, that these rural counties really understand the value of education. I mean, they public schools, and they're everybody's aunt or sister as a teacher in a public school. They only have these public schools, and they really are the heart of the community. They go to Friday football games. They have the marching band. They have the school plays. All those things. That they're a valued part of the community. I think it's more challenging in the urban areas, and it's like especially in places like Memphis and Nashville, where we've already peeled off a lot of families for private schools, and there's all segregation issues and more challenges. But I think these rural communities really receive the message well, and I think the ministers there do, because they understand and value public schools as the heart of community. I've heard Pastor Johnson say, home, schools, church. I mean, that's kind of the heart of their community.
Right. So tell me in the few minutes we have left about how your board is responding to the current crisis with the coronavirus, and what plans have you made to reopen, which at some point everybody will, but no one's quite certain when that point will be.
Well, we don't know. The answer is we don't know. I think that's kind of where a lot of people are. We let out of school mid-March. On a side note, I will mention that I looked into testing. There are a lot of parents very upset that we were not going back to school. We had not one day from the time that we let out, which I believe was March 13th, until the end of the school year that was test-free in our district. Yeah. So standardized testing. I mean, that not every child is not testing every day, but that means that we have very limited instructional time. So, we've let out, we had an announcement yesterday that will just be evidence-based. Our superintendent is working closely with the mayor and the Metro Health Department to make the determination of how to move forward. There are 3 options. One is if we kind of go back to normal, we will go back to school normally. If there is minimal spread, we would go back to school trying to follow the CDC guidelines, which I don't know how in the heck we're going to do that in a large urban district, but it would be a very, children wearing masks in school. And then if we have a growth in the outbreak, then we will just not go back to school. Our mayor, we have a relatively new mayor, and I'm excited to have a mayor that I think is truly supporting our public schools. Really, we've been through several mayors in Nashville, but this one really does seem to want to do the right thing. And so he has purposed the CARES funds to purchase a laptop for every public school student in Nashville. And then he is also going to get internet connections for everyone through hotspots. So if we do end up having to stay home, that will help in the fall. But we've worked really hard to feed the kids and continue the school, the program that's feeding the kids, and also to get everybody the tools they need to succeed. And otherwise, I think by July 1st, there's going to be some kind of announcement as to whether we will actually reopen the schools in fall.
Mm-hmm. So why is there so much testing going on during this period?
Well, that is the time of year that we typically test. And I think there are several prongs of the reform movement. We've got charters and vouchers, and testing supports the privatization movement because you can show that the schools are, quote, failing, and then therefore you need to sell them more things. Like we need to sell them a curriculum that someone can profit off of, or we need to open more charter schools, or now we need to have vouchers to fix the problems. We've just had immense amounts of testing. It's also part of the teacher accountability, so-called accountability, which is absurd because in Tennessee, 70% of teachers are actually evaluated on classes that they've never taught because not that many we have testing in certain grade levels, but all of the arts and PE and foreign language, and then all of the non-tested grade levels are not, they don't have in-class test scores. And so it's kind of like Russian roulette. They get to pick. They say, well, if the fourth graders are doing really well this year, so perhaps we'll be rated on their math scores, or perhaps we'll be rated. I mean, it's really absurd. So all of this, I feel like all of these reform efforts are just part and parcel of one larger effort, which is to profit off of public schools and public school children. I think some of the ideas started out as something more pure, but it's just the schools are, they're a source of profit for a lot of people. And so the tests are sort of the basis of that. The test companies make millions and millions of dollars off of our kids in Tennessee.
Well, wasn't William Sanders the initial
Yes.
guy who started the EVAS, the educational evaluation using test scores? I always like to point out that he was an agricultural statistician and that his expertise was in measuring the growth of corn and cows.
Right.
That, right. You can control all the conditions with corn and cows. You can't control all the conditions where there are children in classrooms and teachers. There's so many variables, and the research has been overwhelming that while teachers are very, very important, the home is even more important. And that's really determinative of whether children do well in school. And there are outliers on both ends, but on the whole, children who come from homes where they're well-fed and have regular medical care and are surrounded by educated people who use big words and have a large vocabulary and so forth, they will do better on tests than kids who don't have those advantages. And that's simply a fact and not just a speculation. I think that, doesn't it outrage people when they hear that 70% of teachers in Nashville, this is true nationally, by the way, not just in Nashville, but the teachers are being evaluated in subjects they didn't teach and students they never met? Doesn't that, when people hear that, don't they say this is ridiculous?
I think so. And I just think people are just not aware. I mean, when we've tried to share this information, it's sort of like they say, well, how is that? You have to kind of explain why this is so. But, when you just look at you have a surface level veneer view of what's happening, you say, well, we're holding our teachers accountable. And, without recognizing all those factors that you're talking about, I think the teachers are responsible for only, the studies I've seen, 7 to 13% of the performance on the test, because so many outside of school factors weigh in. But again, it's just about raising awareness. And
yeah, well, that's obviously crucial, but I think what's insane is to say that the art teacher is going to be evaluated based on fourth grade math scores.
Right.
And she doesn't know those students and she doesn't teach math, and that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I mean, you can argue, how much influence the teachers have versus the curriculum versus lots of other factors, and people may or may not get it. But I would think everybody would get it that it makes no sense to evaluate someone basically by rolling the dice, because they don't teach fourth grade math. So how can you use those scores? In Florida, by the way, the teachers brought a lawsuit against that. And the judge said, well, it may be unfair, but it's not unconstitutional. Well, I don't know how something can be unfair, but not unconstitutional. But other cities, like in Houston, they threw out the evaluation system because they said it was arbitrary and capricious, and teachers shouldn't be judged this way.
Yeah, I think that was it's just coming into this cold, I came into this totally green, and just figuring these things out slowly. It's just a shocking process. And it's crazy to have these conversations because I think a lot of people just accept that's the way it is. And you think, why is this okay? That's what the conversations I started with 8 years ago. But I've slowly just learned along the way, and most people are just not aware.
Well, I can't help but think that when I was in school back in Houston, Texas, we didn't have all this testing. I mean, somehow we produced the greatest generation, I think. And yet we didn't have standardized testing. We took silly standardized tests, like they'd give us tests that would predict what occupation we would one day hold, which was totally absurd. We would have all sorts of nonsensical tests. But the academic tests were written by our teachers, and they were the ones who had taught us. They knew what we were supposed to have learned, and they could look at the test and say, well, I see that you didn't figure this one out. You need extra help here. But the tests we're using now, it takes them 4 months to get the answers back, and the teachers aren't allowed to discuss the test questions. And I don't even think they see the answers because there's so much test security imposed by the testing companies that they end up not having any diagnostic value.
Right.
And again, it's one of those things where if the parents understood that these tests are totally meaningless, there would be a revolt against them, because we somehow developed as a great country without giving everyone a standardized test constantly, as you're doing now in Nashville. It really is a waste of children's time.
Yeah. I think when one of my children was in third grade, I think we counted that they had something like 30 standardized tests, which is just insane. I mean, I grew up in an era of tests, but we had tests once a year. I get what it says, Iowa. There was one test everybody took. We didn't pay any attention to it. We just sat down for a day or so and took a test. But now there's so much hype around these tests, and the stakes are so high that, children are vomiting. The teachers are under immense stress. Teachers are quitting over all the testing. So I don't know. We've lost sight of good education and what children need to thrive, and meeting, the needs of the whole child and meeting their social emotional needs. I think in Nashville, we are trying to focus more on that. But you can't work around a system that is so flawed, where the focus is constantly on the test. And I'll tell you, my teenage daughter loves to read, and she told me recently she hates her English classes. And I said, really? Because I loved English growing up. But for her, it's like they're analyzing instructional text. They're not reading novels and discussing ideas. They are prepping for the test.
That's the Common Core.
Diane and Amy, if you don't mind, I'm going to let a lot of our viewers, and we have quite a few this evening, enter the dialogue by asking you some questions. So Marla, are you ready with the first question for Amy and Diane?
We have a ton of questions, tons. So I'm going to start with Reverend Foster Johnson.
Yay!
We spoke quite a bit about him tonight. So he has a question for both of you. How do Amy and Diane stay so energized, so committed, and so enthusiastic for this important work?
Well, I'll give my answer, which is that I feel, having been an advocate for testing, having been an advocate years ago for charters, that I have a debt to pay. And so it keeps me focused, because I have to make up for years of lost time.
Well, I guess for me, I just have felt like this has been a calling for me. I wasn't, it started with the flood. I was praying to be useful. I think it's a good way to be useful, but it's also an exhausting way to be useful. But I'm just committed. I feel like this is we can make the biggest impact if we can fix these problems, if we can stamp out the corruption and the private greed, if we can get back to what children need, we can really make the biggest impact in our country. And I see, you mentioned Finland, I see that we have models throughout the world. They're doing a wonderful job meeting children's needs. And so I'm here, I guess, because it's become a calling and a life mission. And I'm glad that I'm able to continue my work with the pastors.
Great, and I guess to springboard off that, we have a question from Cameron Bickray, and I believe Cameron was just appointed the new communications person for Pastors for Texas Children. And she's got a really great question for you, Amy.
Okay.
How do you frame your message and advocacy against charter schools to your faith audience, like pastors? Do you get any resistance to that message? New influx of questions?
Well, so I think people are coming around to better understanding charters. I think it's a more difficult issue than voucher schools because they've been pitched as a way to help marginalized children. I think for me, I share my personal experiences around the charter schools, but there are several problems with them. One is the fiscal impact they're having on school systems. And I'll tell you a personal story about Nashville, because all the problems we talk about with charter schools are coming to fruition. So we have been saying for years that we can't continue to afford opening charter schools because when you open too many charter schools, you're trying to fund two separate competing school systems. And the charters always win that because of state law. We have to pay them first. So this year, we've been having a lot of budget problems in Nashville and we've run out of money. And so we are trying to cut costs, and we have ended up having to close 3 of our schools in a marginalized area. It's primarily African American. These are the schools with less resources and more challenges. But we've had to close these schools to save $3.5 million. And at the same time, Nashville is now spending an additional $6.6 million on charter growth because the charters roll out a new grade every year. So you have a very unfair advantage. And so even though they're pitched as schools that are going to help these low-income areas or children of color, they have a negative impact on the system overall. The other issue is accountability, which I've already talked about with Knowledge Academies. We just don't really have oversight in the spending and where the money is going. There is evidence that charter schools are resegregating school systems. So to me, all of these things are just kind of moral issues. And I think for the pastors, we are trying to serve the least of these. Charter schools are hurting the least of these because they typically don't want to accept the children that are the most costly and challenging to educate. And those would be children that are learning English or children with special needs or, that children in poverty tend to not test as well. We've talked about all the reasons for that. There's nothing wrong with the children. They just need more resources and support. So to me, that is where we should be putting our efforts, is supporting the schools that serve the neediest children and serve all children that open their doors to children any time of the year. So I have a long experience with charter schools. Most people don't have, see those pitfalls. And I think just sharing the truth is probably the best way to help educate faith leaders about what's happening in the charter movement.
Awesome, great. The next question is Louis Malfaro, and I'm going to throw this out for both you and Diane, Amy. Okay. What are some of the promising efforts that you guys are seeing out there? For example, community schools. He wrote early college performance standards. So Diane, I guess we can start with you. What are some of the promising efforts that we're seeing out there?
Well, I've talked about some of these in our previous discussions. The New York State Performance Standards Consortium is a group of about 30 or 40 schools that basically don't take the state test and are free to, they create performance assessments. And what they found, and they've been in existence now since the mid-1990s, so they've done a lot of research, and they found that the kids actually are more, they have exactly the same kids as the public schools, the same percentage of kids who are Black and Hispanic and the same percentage of kids with special needs. They match the school system overall, but they do much better in the Performance Standards Consortium in terms of high school graduation, college entrance, college graduation, and persisting through over the long haul. So they don't measure them by test scores, because everybody says, well, what are your test scores? They don't have test scores, but what they do have is a very solid record over time that these kids will have a better life because they are more committed to their education and will persist. I'm very impressed with what, and I mentioned this last time we met, with what LeBron James is doing in Akron, Ohio, where he made a decision to create a model public school, not a charter school. I mean, celebrities go for charter schools, right? Because that's where the billionaires go. But he decided he would create the LeBron James School. I think that it's called, whether it's the Promise Academy or I Promise Academy, something like that. Basically, the kids have lots and lots of resources. And there are also services and resources for their parents as well. There's a food pantry. There's help for the parents in writing a resume and getting a high school equivalency. So it's a full service community school, and it's made possible because he's backing it with money. What I've seen overall is that our schools are under-resourced, despite the kind of right-wing narrative that we've been throwing money at the schools for years and years. We've not been spending enough on the schools. We've not been spending enough on higher education. We've been shifting the burden of higher education from the state to the students. And now we have something that was unthinkable 40 years ago, which is a whole generation of young people burdened by tens of thousands of dollars in debt. That simply didn't happen. There used to be free community colleges and very low-cost public colleges, and those are rare, if not non-existent today. So I think that our society, I mean, I guess the thing that upsets me the most is that I think our society has, without thinking about it, followed a decision, maybe it started with the Reagan administration, but continued from there, not to invest in education, not to invest in the future, not to invest in higher education, not to invest in K-12 education, and now over the past 20 years to open up the schools for mining by tech companies and by for-profit organizations and testing corporations. It's become a kind of gold mine for all these profiteers and privatizers, rather than thinking about education as the development of the next generation. Understanding that every child has talents, every child needs support and nurturing. Amy, what do you see that's promising?
Oh, Darcy, I think you have to unmute Amy.
Amy's still muted.
Yeah, I think Darcy.
Yeah, can y'all hear me? I'm so sorry. There was a smoke alarm that went off in my house, so I had to mute for a minute. So it's turned off. So I think one good thing that's happening in Tennessee is this community schools movement. And there is a professor out of UT Knoxville, University of Tennessee in Knoxville, who is, I guess, seen as kind of the father of the community schools movement. And he's got 3 rural schools in Tennessee, on East Tennessee area, that are working in partnership with the university there. And then we also, in Memphis, there's a community schools effort, and in Nashville we have an effort funded through our school district. But the community schools are great because they help meet the needs of kids that are coming, children with the highest needs in our district. So they provide wraparound services for kids. And the beauty of this model is that the community school can be tailored to the specific needs of the school. So they're all different, and the parents can have input on what the school looks like. But I've toured different community schools, and they can have things like after school enrichment programs. They might have a bike repair shop, and the same things that Diane was talking about. They have a community garden, just different ways. Basically, and they can have things, I'm sorry, as extreme as you might have a dental clinic in a community school, all sorts of different things that will meet the needs of the kids. And the ones in East Tennessee, they have private funders that will provide dinners for the families in these communities where they need help. And so the idea is that you're placing children who are coming from more challenging backgrounds on the same playing field as children who might come from a middle class home, where they have all these things that Diane's already mentioned, where, you know, they have food, they have their glasses to see the chalkboard, they have after school enrichment, they have arts programs, they have, you know, they have different, you know, the gardens to be outside and be in nature. And I think it's a beautiful idea that's something that we can fight for, instead of just fighting against all these ill-conceived ideas for school reform. I think community schools are a great way. And then the other beauty, I'm sort of rambling, but the other beauty of the program is that you can get all different kinds of people involved. So for example, with the pastors, the churches can be involved in the schools. Businesses could adopt a school, you know, they could have tutoring, or we're going to fund a washer and dryer for the school. So they're just really a lot of, and that's kind of the work that I try to do locally at my children's school, is just getting the community involved and supporting the needs of that specific population.
Well, Amy, while you're talking about getting the pastors involved, the Lynn McCash sent in a question. What is your opinion about the amendment to the state law that's in the legislature today? I actually just saw this online. The change is to a ruling about children being allowed to leave school for 1 hour each day to participate in religious instruction.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't want to speak for the pastors. This has come up, and you know, we have a board that would weigh in on this. In general, I would say the pastors are certainly supportive of the separation of church and state. I can see that this would be problematic potentially, but there has been a big push to allow that. I think the good news is that there was some concern that the school districts would have the burden of transporting the children to their religious instruction, and it appears that this bill is not requiring that parents would have to transport. But anyway, I don't want to speak for the pastors on that, but I do think that could be a problematic new law.
Okay. All right, David Bloom sent in a question. He said, as a Tennessee school board member, you must be inundated with sales pitches from companies selling products that promise to raise test scores. Mm-hmm. Have you been able to keep some autonomy for teachers to design lessons on their own without being required to use test prep?
Well, so we are such a large school district. We have about 85,000 students that we have a separation. The school board does not actually purchase materials. We do approve contracts over a certain amount, but the administration handles most of those. They handle all of the contract negotiations and the selection of products, and then they bring it to us for a final approval. So I do get a lot of sales pitches, but typically I don't get involved in that level. But we have had problems with, you know, the marketing. We've had issues with no bid contracts, with not following procedures, and all of those things I think are being driven by profit motives. And so I have gotten involved in some contract issues.
Great. And this question is for both you and Diane. It's from Lindsay Lyack. And I know, Diane, you've addressed this in some of the other conversations, and I think you always are so eloquent and give such great advice. But this is for both of you. Lindsay asks, what is your advice for a young new teacher who isn't okay accepting this is just the way things are? In other words, tips in advocating for students within their schools and public ed within their districts, while navigating the structures of the districts that they're in, like MNPS. Diane, what advice would you have for young educators?
Well, I think right now we have a problem for young educators, which is that the pipeline has grown much narrower. A lot of the numbers of people entering colleges of education and university programs to prepare teachers have seen a dramatic shrinkage. And this was way before COVID. I'm talking about especially since Race to the Top, which introduced this idea that you'll be judged by test scores And I've been told by young people, I was looking forward to teaching in a Title I school, but I'm afraid that I'll be labeled a failure before I even start because the test scores are low. They were low last year, though they might be equally low next year. And I'll be teaching my heart out and judged by the fact that I'm teaching kids with high needs rather than getting the support I need to teach those kids. So I think it's very discouraging for teachers that the system right now, the status quo is rotten. And unfortunately, the source of the status quo is not in the state legislature, it's in Washington. And of course, Tennessee's senior senator, Lamar Alexander, has had a lot to do with the writing of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And that act softened some of the stupidity of No Child Left Behind, but not enough. Frankly, I think we should be pushing, and I know that law, Every Student Succeeds Act, which says kind of the same thing as No Child Left Behind, that law is going to be reauthorized fairly soon. It'll be before Congress, probably in the next session. And Lamar Alexander won't be there, somebody else will be. So it could be a Democrat or it might be a Republican in charge of the committee. But I think that what needs to happen is to have massive pressure from teachers and from parents to eliminate the mandate for grades 3 through 8 being tested every year. And the key fact is that there is no high-performing nation in the world that tests every child every year. And Amy pointed out earlier that kindergarten children are being expected to take bubble tests, which is ridiculous. But what happens is that when the high stakes test starts in 3rd grade, so then 2nd grade becomes tested to prepare for 3rd grade, and 1st grade takes tests to prepare for 2nd grade, and then kindergartners learn to take tests and hold the pencil so that they can prepare to take the test for 1st grade. And you just feel like at some point we're going to introduce testing in the womb. There has to be some sanity brought to bear on education policy. And the first thing is that we've had 20 years of high stakes testing. It has produced no improvement for American kids. It has robbed children of the joy of learning. It's robbed teachers of the joy of teaching. And it has done tremendous damage to the teaching profession and to American education. So we should acknowledge 20 years is enough. The status quo is really very bad. And we need a fresh vision at the federal level to lift the burden from states and from districts so that people can truly reimagine education with smaller class sizes, with more arts, with more time for a recess and play, and with less focus on preparing to take standardized tests. So what I would say to the young teacher is, if you're going into this profession, understand that it's going to be the hardest job you will ever have, but also the most rewarding. And that 20 years from now, the children that you teach will not remember who was mayor. They will not remember who was on the school board. I'm sorry, Amy. They will not remember who was the school superintendent. They might not even remember who was principal. They will remember you. And that's the great psychic reward of teaching. And that's why people come back year after year, despite the abuse. But what you as a young teacher have to do is to have your sense of what's right for children. And don't let them destroy you. Keep inside in your heart and in your soul a belief in what's right for children. Do the best you can to subvert the system as much as possible without getting fired. And believe in yourself and believe in and hold to your professional ethics and don't let them kill it.
Amy, what advice would you have for a new teacher?
Well, I think that's great advice that Diane just offered. But I would just add that I think getting involved in organizations like Network for Public Education is key, because there is a network, across the state of Tennessee. I think people would be surprised what happens in these quiet groups on social media. We have all kinds of Facebook groups where teachers are very involved in trying to make changes to help the children in their classrooms. And you really can make an impact. And I've seen the perceptions of teaching have really changed since I got on the board. When I first got on our board 8 years ago, teachers were really being scapegoated for everything. But more recently, I think there has been an awakening and a recognition about how important teachers are, and that they really have become victims of a lot of these so-called reform efforts, and they're not able to do what they believe is right for children. So I think teacher voices are becoming more powerful. So the more that teachers can connect with others and organize, you can make a difference at the legislature. You know, and also, again, I feel like a lot of the battle is just raising awareness about what's happening, and teachers have a lot of power. People respect teacher voices. So that would be my addition to Diane's thoughts.
Okay, this might be our last question. I don't know, but I think it's one that both Amy, you and Diane can also answer, because Diane, I know you write a lot about the great slayers in slaying Goliath, and definitely can talk to this. But this is from Lori Kirkpatrick, and Lori says she's from Dallas, Texas. She's a former school board candidate against an ed reform candidate. She was outspent 312,000 to 52,000, and she lost by 15 votes. Continues to blog and advocate for public education, but she feels the message is just lost on folks. What advice do you have for spreading the message effectively? And she wants to thank you both for your service to this great cause. So Diane, I'll start with you, and then Amy, you can take after that. How do we spread this message effectively?
Well, first of all, let me say that I was very aware of Lori's race, and I think she won the initial primary and had a runoff, and she was the clear front runner in the primary. But then the guy she was running against had so much money that he dwarfed her, and it was heartbreaking to come so close. I think the really important thing to do is to get the news out about who's putting the money up. And the public is really shocked by that. In my book, I write about the referendum in Massachusetts, and when it was about whether to expand charters statewide, and when the Walton money was behind it from the beginning. And the Waltons did polling in the spring of 2016, and they said, this is going to be a slam dunk. It's going to pass easily, because we're going to pitch to the public that this is all about helping poor kids, Black and Hispanic kids, and it's the matter of conscience to vote for more charters. But then the leader of the teachers, Barbara Manaloni in Massachusetts, said, we can't let this happen because it will devastate public school budgets across the state. The Waltons wanted to make it possible to open 12 new charter schools every year in perpetuity in any community in the state, regardless of need or any community. So that really made it a statewide struggle to protect public education. So the message on the teacher's side was, this is a threat to public schools. And the message from the Waltons was you know, save Black and Hispanic children. But then the truth began to come out about where the money was coming from. And in my book, I write about a professor at University of Massachusetts who was putting out constant reports about who was paying for this. And it was the Waltons, and it was Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City. And it was billionaires in Boston and billionaires in California and billionaires here. And the message came across, first of all, to people on the ground who were fighting this referendum. You're up against billionaires from across the country. And that then filtered out to people in the community. They are trying to buy your public school and take money away from your public schools by setting up this competing system. And when the votes were counted, it was the reverse of what the Waltons expected. Instead of going 62-38 for charters, it went 62-38 against charters. And so a project in educating the public to who is behind this, what do they really want, and what will be the impact on your local public schools. And Amy talked about the devastating fiscal impact on the public schools in Nashville because charters come first. And when the voters in Massachusetts understood that this money would be taken away from their public schools to open up a competing system, they didn't want that. They said no. And follow the money. Follow the money is crucial.
Amy, what would be your advice?
Well, so first of all, I'm sorry because I think I could easily be in your shoes. I mean, the amount of money that's being spent at these races is just is shocking. But I think probably you have some name recognition at this point, having come so close. And what I've done, and I just did what I naturally do. My background was in legal writing, and I didn't realize how helpful that would be in this role as a board member, but I have tried to get the message out just by writing. So I have a Facebook page, but you can use some, a blog would probably be better, but a blog and a Facebook page, or putting things on Twitter. And I just tell stories about what is happening in the school district. I talk a lot about follow the money and who's funding efforts and who's behind things that appear to be grassroots. We've had just, crazy events at our school board with, people shouting through bullhorns, and they flew in the Black Alliance, which was an organization funded by the Waltons and Gates, to stage events at our school board. So when those things happen, I just wrote about it. Here's who's funding it. And that was sort of shocking to a lot of people. And then for me, I think I've just repeated the same message 800,000 times, and just, here are the problems. I try to identify and enumerate the issues. I talk about the funding. I talk about, kind of the ruse and the circus-like atmosphere that a lot of this they try to create in the school board. So just sharing information, sharing experiences, and I think people are moved by stories. So I think that if you can tell stories about what's happening and how it's impacting people or students or teachers, it's helpful. But mostly just, I think, being a voice, if you write, that's a good way to do it. And it's a good way, anybody can do that on social media.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for joining us. And Diane, thank you. It's been a great conversation. And I think you both shared some terrific advice. I want to remind everybody, because I know so many people on this call, we're planning to go to our conference and hear Amy and others. It's going to be next April. We're not giving up. We eventually will be through COVID, and we'll be together again. And we'll get together again next week at this time, when Diane's guest will be Julian Vasquez-Halig. So thank you very much, Amy, and good luck to you in your new position. And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Diane.